When using PowerShell, you will occasionally find that the default output display for the object or objects you're working with is not what you want. For example, get-host by default displays its properties in a list. If we use our get-host command to get a host object, get the handle of that object, reach inside with the dot, and run our getType method to find out what type of object getHost made, that output is displayed as a table, despite the fact it's only one object, and this is basically a list of properties. But in one case it's displayed as a table, in another case it's displayed as a list, and these may not be the choices that we want. In addition to whether it's formatted as a list or a table, the other thing that we may notice is that while the getHost commandlet does display all of the properties, because we've investigated that one before we know this to be true, we also know that the getType method returns a type object, and that type object has far more properties than what is in the default display. On top of that, the properties that it does show aren't necessarily the ones that we would want. So it's very handy to remember that when you produce these objects, if you're producing them to display them on the screen, that you can control not only whether it's a list or a table, but also which properties you're showing, and you can even control the formatting, such as column width and so on. The two commandlets of interest to us are format-table, which takes whatever objects are fed to it and formats them in table format, such as we just saw coming out of getType, or format-list, which produces a list of properties like we see coming out of the getHost commandlet. Many commandlets that produce multiple objects by default display those output objects in a table, simply because it usually makes sense to put the property names across the top, since they're the same for all objects, and then just display one object per line. But it doesn't always work that way. To take an object that is being displayed as a list and have it displayed as a table instead, simply take the object and pipe it to format table. If on the command line for format table you put a comma-separated list of which properties you want, you will only get those properties. So if I were to take get-host and pipe that to a format table with the property list name, comma, version, instead of getting a list with all the default properties, I will get a table with only two properties. When it does this, it automatically sizes the columns to fit the best it can on the screen. If you change the size of your window, it can display more data per line. If you're dealing with PowerShell prior to version 5, if you're dealing with a machine that is stuck on PowerShell version 4 or 3, you'll want to use the -auto size parameter with your format table so that it does figure out the correct sizes. Prior to PowerShell version 5, the format table command did not automatically size them. Format table is used so much, there's an alias for it, just the letters FT, which means we could have typed our last command as getHost piped to FT and the properties that we wanted in our output. Same thing. There are some examples on the next slide that you can try to generate objects in multiple formats. Note that unless you're using a version of PowerShell prior to 5, which I don't think anyone is in this class anymore, the first two examples on this slide will produce exactly the same output. The third example uses getDate and some of its methods to produce a collection of date-time objects and then display the output having the properties that we want ordered the way we want. It is also instructive to try the last example here, because remember, every commandlet in PowerShell produces one or more objects or no output. So when Format Table is making output, don't be fooled into thinking it's just printing text on your screen. It's not. It's making objects. It can be interesting to see what kind of objects Format Table is making. To find that out, you could run a command that uses Format Table and pipe that to get member. It will show you what objects are coming out of Format Table. Format Table is designed to be used at the end of a pipeline. You would not normally ever put it anywhere else unless you're doing something like this to explore the content of those objects. We mentioned there is also a format list. Like Format Table, it displays things, but it takes them and displays them as a list. If you have multiple objects, it will display a list of all the properties of the first object. Then it will display a list of all the properties of the second object, then the third one, and so on. Both Format List and Format Table can be given a list of properties to display in order to display specific properties. One of the nice features of that property list is it recognizes the wildcard asterisk, the star. If you put star for the property list, you will get all properties that will normally display. So if I wanted to run get-date and display the date time, it will. We all know this is just a pretty printed version. There are actually properties hiding behind this. If I wanted to see those properties, I could pipe that to a format list. And if I wanted to make sure I got all of the properties, I could format list star, all properties. And it will show me all of the properties that were in that object as a list. If I do a commandlet that produces multiple objects, and I pipe that to a format list star, the first object coming through the pipe will have all of its properties displayed in a list. Then the next object will, then the next object will, and so on. We know from past exercises that process objects are actually quite big. They have a lot of different properties in them. And we know that if we run get process, we'll get quite a few processes. So we would expect this command to make a lot of output. And indeed, it does. Because for every process, we get the full list of properties and values. We'll wait a moment for that to finish so that we can look at one thing. Namely, how do we know where one object list ends and the next one begins? If we scroll back on one of these lists, we'll see that there is a blank line. That separates the list of properties from one object from the list of properties of another object. So each of these lists of properties comes from a single process, and the process lists are separated by blank lines. There are some examples for format list to see how it works and what it will display. These are also worthwhile. I would suggest you do the exercises for format table and format list and ensure you're comfortable with them. These are very commonly used commands to organize and print your output from scripts.